Shabbat Shalom. For those of you who came of age around a certain time, the Dry Bones comic in the Jerusalem Post was one of the prisms through which you reflected on events happening in Israel and the Jewish world. It was a bit before my time, but I know that the relatable characters with Yiddish names like Schuldig helped readers keep a sense of humor, no matter what was going on in Israel. Why call it Dry Bones? Yaakov Kirshen, the cartoonist, was inspired by the biblical prophet Ezekiel and his vision of the Valley of Dry Bones. In fact, Kirshen created a whole graphic novel depicting Ezekiel chapter 37, Ezekiel's visit to the Valley of Dry Bones. He draws a bewildered Ezekiel, wandering the canals of Babylon, immersed in the memories of his ancestors, when suddenly he's picked up, carried off, and set down in a valley full of bones, very dry bones. God speaks to him, assuring him that these bones will live and will end up in the land of Israel. And that text, Ezekiel chapter 37, the Valley of Dry Bones, is the prophetic portion that we just read today as our Haftarah, and every year we read on Shabbat Chol HaMoed Pesach. So here's my question. What does the resurrection of dry bones have to do with Passover? Of all the prophetic portions that we could read, why was this Haftarah chosen for today? In my quest to find the answer, I turned first to the Eitz Chaim Chumash, the Torah text you have in front of you, which explains the reason why Ezekiel's vision of resurrection was chosen for reading on Pesach is somewhat obscure. Not very helpful. The answer must lie in the question, whose bones are these? Because we know who Passover is about. Passover is the founding story of our people. The moment when a group of slaves joins together to rally around a new leader, risk everything to escape from Egypt, and begin a 40-year journey of wandering and community building. The Exodus narrative is so central to who we are as a people that we refer to it constantly in our daily liturgy, our Shabbat liturgy, our holiday liturgy, not just on Passover. So if this is the holiday of our peoplehood, how does a resurrection of dry bones fit in, and whose bones are they? The text in Ezekiel itself says that these bones are those of Kol Beit Yisrael, the whole house of Israel. They are the bones of the entire Jewish people. An eerie vision that could lead us to believe that Ezekiel is prophesizing the death and subsequent resurrection of the Jewish people. Cartoonist Yaakov Kirshen, in his graphic novel, offers photographs from the Holocaust, piles of bones in concentration camps, followed by the liberation of those camps, as his interpretation of Ezekiel's vision coming to fruition. But while the connection between the Holocaust and Israel may explain Kirshen's choice, it does not solve our question. After all, the Passover story is not the story of an Israelite people fully destroyed and returning from the dead. Rashi offers an alternative interpretation, that these are the bones of the Israelites from the time of the Exodus, specifically a particular group who miscalculated how long their bondage was meant to last, so they left Egypt too early and were killed on their way out by the Philistines. These are their dry old bones that are revived as a sign of messianic days to come. So it makes sense that we read the story of these bones on Passover, when we commemorate the Exodus from Egypt. The Passover story and our Seder ritual is meant to take us from shame to praise, from the depths to the heights. And imagining these over-eager Hebrews who tried to escape slavery too early but in the end are saved and resurrected is a powerful image of that spiritual journey. Now, I love Rashi as much as the next rabbi, and his interpretation is certainly inspiring. But I struggle to find any biblical allusions to the fact that these bones Ezekiel is seeing are in fact those of this group who left Egypt too early. I do not fault Rashi for his inventiveness. I am all for creative readings of a text to add meaning and relevance for readers. So in that spirit, I'd like to offer one of my own. Whose bones are these? Those of the biblical Joseph. The only instances in the 5 books of Moses when we hear of someone's bones, we're talking about Joseph. So let's review the story. Though Joseph was born in Canaan, he ends up in Egypt after his brothers grow jealous of him and sell him into slavery. He ends up in an Egyptian prison, but he uses his powers of dream interpretation, his charming personality, and his leadership and organizational skills to rise up and become one of the most powerful people in the land. When he dies, still living in Egypt, he makes his brothers, who he's now reconciled with, take an oath that whenever the Jewish people make it to the land of Israel, they are to bring his bones with them. He wants to be buried in the promised land. We can learn 2 things from this story about Joseph's beliefs at the end of life. Number 1, he feels deeply connected to the land of Israel, despite not having stepped foot there for some time, and he wants to know that it will be his eternal resting place. And 2, he believes wholeheartedly that the Jewish people will make it back there. He knows it won't be this generation, but that at some point in the future, his family's descendants would leave Egypt, go to Israel, and bring his bones with them. Now let's fast forward to the generation who fulfills this dream of leaving Egypt. Moses leads the people out, and he personally picks up Joseph's bones and carries them out of Egypt and throughout the journey in the desert. Not Moses' assistant, not Moses' delegate, Moses himself. This was too important a task to leave to someone else. While all the other Israelites leave with spoils from Egypt, Moses instead prioritizes fulfilling the dreams and wishes of his ancestor Joseph, who wanted his body to make it back to the land of Israel. Now, I'm not alone in my belief that Joseph's bones played an important role in the Exodus narrative. When we recite Hallel each day of Passover and sing B'tzeit Yisrael, as we did today, the psalm about the Israelites crossing the sea, we sing Hayam Ra'a Vayanos. The sea saw them and fled. A fascinating personification of the sea. The psalm turns the narrative we know, Moses splitting the sea, on its head. 14th century Spanish commentator Rabbeinu Bachya says that it's not just the Israelites that the sea flees from, but Joseph's bones. When Moses approaches, the sea could sense the great presence of Joseph and his role in the survival of the Jewish people, and in awe, it flees. Many commentators over the years have picked up on the role of Joseph's bones in the Exodus story. Similarities in words used in the texts of the 2 stories, the 4 cups of wine at the Seder, and the famous cup incident whereby Joseph tests his brother's loyalty, the dipping during the Seder, and the dipping of Joseph's multicolored coat in blood. So during the holiday, when we recount this Exodus story, we read a haftarah about bones. The bones that led us into Egypt initially, the bones that allowed us to prosper in Egypt, the bones that knew that we would one day leave Egypt for Israel, the bones that longed for the promised land. When the text in Ezekiel refers to the bones of the whole house of Israel, of course they must be Joseph's bones. Who else could represent the whole of the Jewish people and our foundational story. And in fact, the phrase, Kol Beit Yisrael, the whole house of Israel, is used again later on in this very chapter of Ezekiel, after the conclusion of our Haftarah. The rest of the chapter contains a second vision, where Ezekiel is instructed to take 2 sticks, write on one of them of Judah, and write on the other one of Joseph, and join them together in one hand so that they become one nation. And on the Joseph stick, Ezekiel is supposed to write, V'chol Beit Yisrael Chaveiro, and the whole house of Israel associated with him. In this vision, Joseph is the whole house of Israel, the struggles and the triumphs, the lows and the highs, the despair and the overwhelming hope for a promised future. Ezekiel, despondent in Babylon, is transported to a valley, a dry desert, where he sees bones that will be resurrected. His vision transports him to a redemptive future, where the bones of Joseph live on in the land of Israel, the spirit of Joseph in the people of Israel. This is not the story of an entire people wiped out and miraculously rising from the ashes. Nor is it the story of a small group of overeager former slaves who are resurrected in the promised land. No. This Haftorah is the story of one man's legacy that lives on. And his legacy is longing for Israel. Though each of our patriarchs and matriarchs have their own connection to the promised land, and Abraham is the one initially told to leave his home and go there, Joseph is the first of our ancestors to express longing for Israel, a love of Israel so deep that he feels it in his bones. Perhaps Joseph could be considered the first Zionist, the first in a long line of people who will long for Zion. Our biblical holidays always call Israel to mind, modern Israel and what our ancient ancestors would have been doing there to celebrate the festival. But on no biblical holiday do we long for Israel more than Passover. The story of Passover is literally the mechanism by which we end up in Israel. We end every Seder with Lishana Haba'ah B'Yerushalayim next year in Jerusalem, and on the Shabbat during Passover, we read the prophetic vision of Joseph's bones finally revived in the promised land after years of longing. Central to the themes of Passover is this very longing for Israel, Joseph's, the Hebrew slaves, and our own. With Joseph's spirit revived within all the people Israel on this holiday, we say, Lishana Haba'ah B'Yerushalayim, next year with greater connection to Jerusalem, next year with more longing for the promised land. Shabbat Shalom.